It was supposed to be a simple summer project. Nothing more than a few paper cups, a folding table, and a pitcher of homemade lemonade. The neighborhood kids, full of energy and optimism, set up their little stand on the corner of our cul-de-sac. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the cheerful hand-painted sign swayed in the warm breeze. To them, it was an adventure. To me, their parent, it was a lesson in hard work, community, and the joy of earning your first dollar. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. Neighbors strolled by with smiles, cars slowed down to make purchases, and even the mailman bought 2 cups. It felt like one of those moments you'd remember forever, the kind that made suburban life seem idyllic. But then came the slow-rolling SUV, the tinted window lowering just enough to reveal a scowl that could sour any lemonade. It was Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was the self-appointed guardian of the Homeowners Association rules, walking the streets with a clipboard in hand and a permanent look of disapproval etched into her face. She'd complained about overgrown grass, trash bins being left out a day too long, and even wind chimes that she claimed were too loud. So when her eyes locked onto my kid's lemonade stand, I felt a pang of dread. Within minutes of spotting us, she was on the phone. She wasn't just calling to complain to me or the HOA board. She was calling the cops. And sure enough, 2 patrol cars rolled down the street as though responding to a major crime in progress. The officers were polite but firm. They explained that someone had reported an unauthorized business operating on HOA property, and that the HOA bylaws technically prohibited sales of any kind without prior approval. My kids, confused and scared, packed up their table and cups while Karen watched from across the street with her arms crossed, clearly satisfied with herself. The neighbors were stunned. A few came over to voice support, shaking their heads at how ridiculous it was to shut down a lemonade stand. But Karen had done her damage. What should have been a happy afternoon ended with disappointed children, crushed spirits, and me fuming with a quiet rage. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of untouched lemonade cups. The HOA rules were strict, sure, but they weren't unbreakable. They had been written for big problems, people running noisy auto shops out of their garages or turning their homes into rental properties without permission. Not for children selling 50-cent lemonade. Karen had taken those rules and twisted them into a weapon. But if she wanted to play that game, I was prepared to play it better. Over the next few days, I began digging through the HOA bylaws myself. If there was a loophole, I would find it. I spent hours online, reading legal forums, HOA horror stories, and advice from people who had fought back against overzealous neighbors. And then I found it. A single line buried deep in the regulations. Commercial activities are prohibited within HOA common areas, unless they are temporary events benefiting the community and conducted on privately owned lots with proper signage and vehicle access. That was it. The golden ticket. If I couldn't run a stand on the sidewalk, I could run it out of my driveway. And if I was going to do it, I wasn't going small. I wasn't just going to set up a table again. I was going to turn my home into the most extravagant lemonade operation the neighborhood had ever seen. The plan started to take shape in my mind, and with every passing day my frustration turned into determination. Karen had embarrassed my kids, made them feel like criminals over something innocent. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I was going to hit back so hard the entire neighborhood would see it, and best of all, it would be completely within the rules. As the weekend approached, I began making calls. I borrowed folding canopies, dug out old extension cords, and convinced a friend with a food truck to lend me some signage. I even went to a restaurant supply store and bought professional-grade drink dispensers. A chalk arrow pointed directly to our garage, now transformed into a serving station complete with coolers, ice buckets, and even a tip jar. Before the first customer even arrived, I saw Karen at her window, clutching her phone like a sword ready for battle. She thought she'd won last week. She had no idea what was coming. By noon, cars were lined up down the block. Neighbors were honking, waving, and laughing as they pulled through, happy to pay $1 or $2 for a cold drink. Some even brought cookies and snacks to contribute. My kids' disappointment from the week before melted away as they worked the stand like seasoned pros, filling cup after cup with wide smiles. The operation was so smooth, it felt less like a neighborhood lemonade stand and more like a roadside event. Karen stormed out of her house, waving her arms and shouting at anyone who would listen. She marched straight over to me, but I didn't stop smiling. I knew I had the HOA bylaws printed and highlighted, ready to go. And as I suspected, it wasn't long before she made the call again. Only this time, when the officers arrived, they didn't shut us down. They looked over my paperwork, nodded in approval, and even bought lemonade themselves before driving off. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. Her plan to crush us had backfired spectacularly, and she knew it. But this was just the beginning. I had a feeling she wasn't going to give up that easily, and I had no intention of backing down. The war between my family and Karen had officially begun. The day after our lemonade drive-thru debut, the neighborhood was buzzing, and not just because of the sugar rush. Cars that hadn't been down our street in years were suddenly cruising through just to see the spectacle. Neighbors posted photos online, and word spread far beyond our cul-de-sac. What had started as a petty attempt by Karen to crush a children's lemonade stand had now turned into a community event, and everyone wanted to be part of it. Everyone, of course, except Karen. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the worst was behind us. The HOA officers hadn't stopped us. The police had literally bought lemonade from my kids, and most of the neighborhood seemed thrilled with our operation. But if I'd learned anything from living near Karen, it was that she never stopped at one move. She treated every dispute like a chess match, and she was already plotting her next strike. The first sign came in the form of an email. It was a formal complaint from the HOA board citing increased traffic, potential safety hazards, and unauthorized commercial signage. The language was cold and clinical, but I knew exactly whose fingers had typed the original message that sparked it. Karen was using the HOA as her personal weapon. I could almost hear her voice in every sentence. Soon after, the letters began arriving. They warned of fines if we continued to disrupt the character of the neighborhood. They threatened to escalate the issue to a formal hearing. And then, just to twist the knife, they sent a notice claiming our decorative flags and driveway banner violated community guidelines about unapproved outdoor displays. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was this really worth it? I looked at my kids, now giddy with excitement every time they counted the cash box at the end of the day. I remembered how crushed they'd been when Karen shut them down the first time. How unfair it felt to see them treated like troublemakers for something so innocent. The HOA's threats only hardened my resolve. If Karen wanted a war, I was ready to fight, and I wasn't going to fight small. Over the next week, I expanded our lemonade drive-thru into a full-scale roadside event. Friends dropped off tables and tents. A neighbor offered his generator so we could run fans and lights. Someone donated an old sandwich board for the end of the street, and I painted it with bold letters, "Fresh lemonade, drive-thru open." What began as a few cars trickling through turned into a steady stream of customers. Parents brought their kids just to show them what standing up to a bully looked like. Someone even called the local paper, and before I knew it, a reporter showed up with a camera crew. They loved the story, Cranky Neighbor versus Neighborhood Lemonade Heroes. By the end of the segment, we weren't just selling lemonade, we were local celebrities. Karen, of course, was furious. She began standing outside her house, arms folded, glaring at every car that drove by. She started taking photos of license plates, scribbling notes on her clipboard, and shouting at passers-by about rules and safety. I ignored her, but she wasn't going away. Then came the next escalation. The HOA scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss unauthorized commercial activity. It was clear what this was about. They wanted to shut us down for good. Karen had managed to drag the entire board into her vendetta, and if they voted against us, we'd face heavy fines. The night of the meeting, I showed up armed with every document I could find. I brought a copy of the bylaws with highlighted sections proving our drive-thru was on private property. I brought traffic data showing our street saw no more congestion than a normal delivery day. And I brought signatures from dozens of neighbors who supported what we were doing. The boardroom was packed. Karen sat in the front row, smirking like she'd already won. She presented photos of cars lined up, videos of children waving signs, and a list of infractions she claimed we'd committed. From the size of our banner to the disturbance caused by honking horns. She painted our lemonade stand as a threat to the entire community, a reckless circus that endangered children and property values. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice calm. I explained that this was about more than lemonade. It was about community, about teaching kids the value of hard work, about neighbors coming together instead of tearing each other apart. I pointed out the exact clause that allowed temporary events like ours, so long as they were on private lots. And then I dropped the hammer. Not only was our drive-through legal, but the HOA had no authority to regulate the inside of my garage, where the actual serving took place. The room murmured. Karen's face tightened. The board was cornered. They couldn't contradict their own bylaws, not with so many witnesses present. In the end, they tabled the discussion, clearly frustrated but unwilling to make a ruling they knew wouldn't hold up. It was a temporary victory, but a sweet one. We walked out of that meeting to a round of quiet applause from neighbors who had come to support us. Karen stormed off before anyone could speak to her. But I knew this wasn't over. People like Karen don't accept defeat, they double down. And sure enough, within days, new letters began arriving. This time, they weren't about our stand directly. They nitpicked everything. The height of our lawn, the placement of our trash cans, even the color of our mailbox flag. It was obvious harassment. She was trying to bury us under a pile of petty violations, hoping we'd fold from the pressure. Instead of folding, I decided to go bigger. If Karen thought our lemonade drive-thru was disruptive now, she had no idea what was coming next. I made calls to friends outside the neighborhood, people with food trucks and sound systems. If the HOA wanted to accuse us of running a business, I was about to give them one they couldn't ignore. One that was so successful the entire town would be on our side. The stage was set for the next round of our battle. Karen thought she could scare us into silence. What she didn't realize was that every letter she sent, every complaint she filed, only fueled our determination to fight back louder, brighter, and sweeter than ever. Karen's harassment didn't slow us down. It fueled us. Every petty notice, every complaint, every nitpicked violation she filed against our family became the spark for something bigger. If she wanted to treat us like we were running a major business, then we were going to become one. I spent the next week transforming our little lemonade drive-thru into a full-fledged roadside attraction. Word had already started spreading beyond our subdivision. But I wanted to make sure this became something no one in the HOA, not even Karen, could ignore. With help from friends, I arranged for a small food truck to park in our driveway as a serving station. We upgraded from paper cups to custom-printed cups with a logo my kids designed themselves. We even added flavored lemonades, iced tea, and snacks. What once looked like a child's summer project now looked like a professional operation. By Saturday morning, we were ready. We hung a giant banner at the entrance of the street. Neighborhood lemonade drive-thru, open today. Balloons marked the path. A friend set up speakers to play upbeat music, and neighbors volunteered to help direct traffic. When we opened, it was like flipping a switch. Cars rolled in nonstop. Some people came because they'd seen the local news segment about us. Others came because their friends told them about the lemonade stand that defied the HOA. The line of vehicles stretched around the corner, but no one minded waiting. Kids leaned out of windows to wave. Parents took photos like they were at a festival. My kids stood behind the counter, working the register and serving drinks with smiles as wide as the driveway. It wasn't just lemonade anymore, it was a statement. We were showing the neighborhood, and the whole town, that a bully couldn't shut down something good just because she wanted to feel powerful. Karen, of course, was livid. She stood on her lawn with her phone out, pacing like a guard on duty. She filmed every car, scribbled in her clipboard, and shouted to anyone within earshot about illegal businesses and dangerous traffic. At one point, she even tried to block the entrance to our driveway, only to be politely escorted back to her property line by a passing police officer, the same officer who had bought lemonade from us the week before. But Karen wasn't just angry. She was desperate. She started calling anyone she could. City code enforcement, county zoning, even the health department. Inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand, but they left shaking their heads. Everything we were doing was legal. Everything was clean, safe, and properly run. We weren't selling out of the street or HOA property. We were selling from our own driveway. And best of all, the neighbors loved it. As the day went on, something unexpected happened. People didn't just come for lemonade. They came to show support, to cheer us on, to stand against Karen and her heavy-handed tactics. Someone brought lawn chairs and set them up across the street like they were watching a parade. A local bakery dropped off pastries to sell alongside our drinks. Even the mailman came back on his off-duty hours just to buy a gallon to take home. By mid-afternoon, the driveway looked like a small festival. Kids were drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. Someone brought a bubble machine. A neighbor offered to handle parking in his yard to keep the street clear. It felt like the whole neighborhood had turned out. Everyone except Karen. She remained on her porch, fuming, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried to summon anyone who would listen. By sunset, we had sold more lemonade than I could have imagined. My kids were exhausted but thrilled, counting the overflowing tip jar as if it were treasure. But the real reward wasn't the money. It was the feeling of unity, of standing up to someone who thought they could push us around. That night, I knew Karen wouldn't let this slide. She'd already failed to use the police and the HOA to stop us, and her calls to inspectors had gone nowhere. Her only option now was to escalate further, and knowing her, she wouldn't hesitate. Sure enough, 2 days later, a letter arrived, this one far more serious than the rest. The HOA had scheduled an official compliance hearing. They were threatening maximum fines, legal action, and even a lien against our property if we didn't shut down immediately. Clearly, Karen had convinced the board to go all in. But what she didn't realize was that every step she took made our story louder. People online were already talking about the lemonade stand HOA war. Neighbors were organizing in our favor, and I wasn't about to walk into that hearing unprepared. I started gathering evidence. Photos, videos, traffic counts, and written statements from supportive neighbors. I even spoke with a lawyer friend who assured me that what we were doing wasn't just legal. If the HOA tried to fine us unfairly, we could fight back and possibly win damages. Meanwhile, we kept running the drive-thru, bigger than ever. The weekend before the hearing, we hosted our largest event yet, complete with music, decorations, and even a donation box for a local children's charity. What began as a fight over lemonade had turned into something far greater, a community rallying against petty tyranny. Karen stood across the street during the entire event, red-faced and trembling with rage, as she watched car after car pull in. People honked and waved at her just to spite her. Some even yelled, "Best lemonade ever," out their windows. By the end of the day, she was visibly shaking, clutching her phone like she was about to snap it in half. It was clear the upcoming HOA hearing wasn't just about a lemonade stand anymore. It was about power, pride, and principle. Karen wanted to crush us at all costs, and she was using every ounce of influence she had to make it happen. But I wasn't worried. If Karen thought she could intimidate us, she was about to learn that her worst nightmare wasn't a lemonade stand. It was an entire neighborhood united against her, and a family that refused to back down. The morning of the HOA compliance hearing carried a heavy tension that no amount of coffee could wash away. For weeks, Karen had been building her case like a prosecutor preparing for trial. She had filed reports, gathered photos, and convinced the board that our lemonade drive-thru was not a neighborhood delight but a threat to order. What she didn't know was that we had been preparing just as carefully, and our evidence wasn't written on paper. It lived in the hearts of our neighbors. The meeting was held in the HOA's community center, a beige room that normally hosted book clubs and bake sales. But that night, it felt like a courtroom. Folding chairs lined the walls, every seat filled with neighbors who had watched the drama unfold in real time. Some came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty, and a few simply to see Karen get what they believed was long overdue. Karen arrived early, dressed like she was walking into a corporate boardroom, clutching her thick folder of complaints. She paced near the front, her eyes darting across the room, glaring at anyone who dared meet her gaze. For her, this was the final push. She wasn't just trying to stop a lemonade stand anymore. She was trying to reassert control over the entire neighborhood. When the board called the meeting to order, Karen wasted no time. She launched into a tirade, flipping through her pages like ammunition. She accused us of running an unlicensed business, causing traffic congestion, lowering property values, and turning a peaceful cul-de-sac into a circus. She waved photos of cars lined up outside our home, videos of kids holding colorful signs, and letters from a few allies she had convinced to see things her way. She painted our family as reckless agitators who thumbed their noses at the rules everyone else had to follow. The room was quiet as she finished, but it wasn't the silence of agreement. It was the silence of neighbors holding their breath, waiting for the other side of the story. When the board turned to me, I rose with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. My folder was thinner than Karen's, but far more powerful. I began with the HOA bylaws themselves, highlighting the clause that explicitly allowed temporary community events conducted on private property. I showed photos of our driveway set up clean, safe, and entirely off HOA-controlled land. Then came the signatures, pages of them, from neighbors supporting what we were doing. Finally, I presented letters from local businesses and even the city inspector confirming we were not violating any codes or ordinances. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could see that Karen's case, while loud and dramatic, was built more on personal resentment than actual violations. And then something unexpected happened. One by one, neighbors stood to speak. A father who said his kids had learned about teamwork by helping at the stand. A grandmother who said the lemonade drive-thru was the highlight of her summer. Even the mailman, still in uniform, stepped forward to tell them how proud the whole town was of this family refusing to back down. The energy in the room shifted. The board members, who at first looked ready to deliver a harsh verdict, now seemed hesitant. They asked questions about safety, about parking, about how long we planned to run the stand. I answered calmly, showing our plans to keep everything organized and temporary, emphasizing that this wasn't a business empire. It was a community project. Karen's face darkened as she realized the board was slipping out of her control. The more people spoke in our favor, the more flustered she became. She tried interrupting, shouting that the rules were the rules and that feelings didn't matter. But her outbursts only made her look desperate. By the time the board voted, it was clear the tide had turned. Their decision was cautious but fair. We were allowed to continue operating the lemonade drive-thru as long as it remained on private property and didn't block the street. No fines, no shutdown order, just a polite reminder to stay mindful of traffic flow. It was a complete defeat for Karen, and everyone knew it. When the meeting ended, neighbors gathered around to congratulate us. The room buzzed with excitement, while Karen slipped out the side door, red-faced and shaking. But even as we celebrated, I knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't walk away quietly. When they lost publicly, they schemed privately. Over the next few days, her behavior became even more erratic. She stood outside for hours, glaring at anyone who approached our driveway. She called in anonymous complaints about trash, lawn height, even noise levels from kids playing. One morning, we found our banner slashed and our balloons popped. We didn't see who did it, but no one needed to ask. Rather than discourage us, the harassment made the neighborhood rally harder. More people came to the drive-thru, some just to show Karen they wouldn't be intimidated. A local radio station ran a segment about the HOA that tried to crush lemonade and lost. Social media lit up with photos and praise, turning our little street corner into a symbol of standing up to unfair rules. But Karen wasn't finished. Late one night, a neighbor spotted her speaking with a city official at the edge of our property. The next morning, we learned she had filed a new complaint, this time claiming we were creating a public safety hazard. If she couldn't use the HOA to shut us down, she was going to try to bring the city itself down on us. It was clear we had reached a new level of conflict. What began as a simple lemonade stand had grown into something much larger, a neighborhood rebellion against one woman's obsession with control. And now Karen was escalating beyond letters and meetings. She was looking for a way to crush us completely, even if it meant dragging city authorities into a suburban squabble. As I watched my kids happily serving drinks to a line of cars, unaware of the storm building just beyond the curb, I knew we needed to be ready. Karen wasn't going to stop, and if she wanted a final showdown, We were going to give her one she'd never forget. Karen's defeat at the HOA meeting should have been the end. Most people would have accepted the board's decision and moved on, even if they didn't like the outcome. But Karen wasn't most people. She thrived on control, and losing publicly had only fueled her determination to win privately. It was no longer about rules or property values. It was about pride. And when pride drives someone like Karen, they don't stop, they escalate. The first sign came in the form of an unfamiliar car idling near our driveway early on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a neighbor or a customer. It was a white city vehicle, the kind code enforcement officers use. The man inside stepped out with a clipboard and a measuring wheel, his orange vest catching the morning sun. My stomach dropped. Karen had done it. She had taken this fight beyond the HOA and into the city's hands. The inspector was polite, but his questions made it clear why he was there. Karen had filed a complaint claiming we were operating an unlicensed commercial business, obstructing traffic, and creating a public safety hazard. It was everything she had accused us of before, but now the stakes were higher. If the city decided we were breaking municipal codes, they could shut us down for good, and no amount of HOA loopholes would save us. As he walked the property, tape measure in hand, I watched from the porch with my heart pounding. I had prepared for this possibility, but facing it in reality was different. Every chalk arrow, every banner, every gallon of lemonade suddenly looked like evidence in a case I couldn't afford to lose. After what felt like an hour, the inspector left without issuing a citation. He said he needed to review the code before making a determination, which gave me time, but not much. The next move was clear. Karen was aiming for the kill shot, and the city was her weapon. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some worried the city might actually side with her. Others laughed at the absurdity of a municipal crackdown on a family lemonade stand. But I didn't find any of it funny. I knew Karen well enough to understand that she wouldn't stop here. If the first inspector didn't shut us down, she'd keep calling until someone did. Rather than wait for the axe to fall, I decided to go on the offensive. That night, I reached out to every person who had supported us, from the neighbors who had signed petitions to the reporter who had covered our story weeks ago. If Karen wanted to make this public, I was going to make it bigger than she ever imagined. The next weekend, our lemonade drive-thru turned into something no one could ignore, a full-scale block party. We called it Lemonade for the Community, and we made it a charity event. Bright flyers went up around town, announcing that all proceeds would go to the local children's hospital. A local band offered to play for free. Food trucks volunteered to join in, and neighbors donated tables, tents, and decorations. When Saturday arrived, the street was unrecognizable. Cars lined both ends of the block. Tents stretched from yard to yard. Kids ran around with painted faces and balloon animals. The band played lively music while volunteers handed out drinks and snacks. It wasn't just a lemonade stand anymore, it was a festival. And it worked. By noon, the crowd was enormous. People came not only for lemonade but to support a cause and take a stand against what they saw as ridiculous harassment. The local news returned with cameras, and this time they weren't just filming a driveway operation. They were filming a community rallying together. Social media exploded with photos and videos, and the story went viral in a way I never expected. Karen, of course, was losing her mind. She stood on her porch, trembling with rage as she filmed everything on her phone, her voice carrying over the music as she screamed about violations and lawsuits. At one point, she stormed across the street toward the event, but a wall of neighbors intercepted her, calmly redirecting her back to her lawn. She was powerless, and it showed. But while Karen couldn't stop the event, she wasn't finished. That evening, after the last tent came down and the music faded, I received an official notice from the city. A formal hearing had been scheduled to review our compliance with municipal codes. If the city ruled against us, the fines would be steep and the shutdown permanent. Karen had managed to drag the fight to the highest level yet, and now the outcome would decide everything. Either we'd prove once and for all that we were within our rights, or we'd lose everything we had built. As I tucked my kids into bed that night, their faces glowing with excitement from the day's success, I felt a mix of pride and fear. We had raised thousands for charity, brought the neighborhood together and stood up to a bully, but now the real battle loomed. The city hearing wasn't like the HOA meeting. This wasn't about neighborly squabbles. This was law. If we lost, it wouldn't just be the end of the lemonade drive-thru. It would be a public victory for Karen, the kind she had been craving all along. And knowing her, she wouldn't stop there. She'd use that victory to regain her grip on the neighborhood and punish anyone who had stood against her. I stared at the official letter on the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. This fight had started because Karen couldn't stand a simple lemonade stand. Now, it had spiraled into something that could change everything, not just for my family, but for everyone who believed in standing up to unjust rules. The date for the hearing was set for the following week. 7 days to prepare. 7 days to make sure we didn't just win, we crushed any chance Karen had of ever pulling something like this again. But as I made my plans and gathered my paperwork, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if this wasn't just Karen's fight anymore? What if the city decided to make an example out of us? If that happened, even the best arguments might not be enough. Still, there was no turning back now. We had come too far. The lemonade war was heading to its final battlefield, and we were either going to emerge victorious or watch everything we built come crashing down. By dawn, the neighborhood was already buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread far beyond the subdivision gates, and cars were lining up on the main road, waiting to turn into the cul-de-sac. The drive-thru lemonade stand had evolved into a full-scale roadside attraction overnight. Bright banners waved in the summer breeze, volunteers in matching shirts guided traffic, and the sweet scent of fresh lemonade carried through the air like an invitation. The family had prepared for this day with meticulous care. Coolers brimmed with ice, gallons of lemonade rested in neat rows, and a small cash box stood ready, though most of the neighbors preferred to donate far more than the modest price per cup. Parents from other streets came by to drop off cookies and snacks, eager to support what had become a battle of principle rather than profit. Children from all over the neighborhood, once intimidated by HOA rules and rigid neighbors, now ran around freely, their laughter echoing across the cul-de-sac. But not everyone was laughing. Behind tightly drawn blinds, Karen watched with a face as pale as the lemonade she despised. Her carefully manicured front yard, always perfectly trimmed to the HOA's standards, had become an island of stillness in a sea of joyous chaos. She had spent the night firing off emails to the HOA board, demanding immediate intervention, citing traffic hazards, zoning violations, and even accusing the parents of running an illegal beverage distribution enterprise. When the HOA board members arrived mid-morning, they were greeted not by a humble lemonade stand, but by what looked like a cheerful community festival. Colorful balloons floated over the driveway, folding chairs lined the sidewalks, and even local news vans had parked nearby, cameras pointed at the spectacle. The parents stood proudly at the heart of it all, ladling lemonade into cups while their kids waved at passing cars like celebrities in a parade. The board tried to assert authority, but every attempt was met with polite defiance. The parents knew the law. Selling lemonade from their private driveway was perfectly legal, and with community support and media coverage, the HOA had little ground to stand on. What was meant to be a petty enforcement issue had turned into a public relations disaster for the association. Karen, however, refused to back down. She stormed across the street, her voice sharp and indignant, demanding that everyone pack up and leave. But instead of the frightened compliance she was used to, she was met with stony silence. Neighbors turned their backs on her, refusing to engage. Even the HOA board members, wary of the cameras recording every moment, avoided her gaze. The power she once wielded had slipped through her fingers, replaced by the collective will of an entire community tired of being bullied. As the afternoon sun blazed overhead, the line of cars stretched farther than ever. Local police arrived again, but this time not to shut the event down. They came to manage traffic and ensure everyone stayed safe. They even bought lemonade themselves, smiling for the cameras and praising the kids for their entrepreneurial spirit. It was the ultimate blow to Karen's crusade, a public show of support that undermined every complaint she had ever made. By sunset, the drive-thru lemonade stand had raised hundreds of dollars. Neighbors cheered as the kids held up a sign announcing, They would donate a portion of the profits to a children's hospital. The victory wasn't just financial. It was moral, a declaration that kindness and community spirit would always triumph over pettiness and control. Karen retreated to her house, curtains drawn tight, as the sound of music, laughter, and clinking lemonade cups filled the evening air. She had tried to crush a simple act of childhood joy with rules and threats, only to see it grow into something unstoppable. The HOA, embarrassed by the entire debacle, quietly decided to review its guidelines, vowing to prevent similar conflicts in the future. Not by enforcing more rules, but by listening to residents before problems spiraled out of control. That night, as the last cars drove away and the family packed up their supplies, they reflected on everything that had happened. What began as a small summer project for their kids had become a turning point for the entire neighborhood. They hadn't just sold lemonade. They'd reminded everyone of the power of standing together. The driveway lights clicked off, the banners came down, and the cul-de-sac returned to its peaceful rhythm. But the story would live on, whispered by neighbors, retold at block parties, and replayed on evening news clips. A legend of how one cranky neighbor's pettiness sparked a movement, and how a family with nothing more than lemons, sugar, and courage had turned it all into the sweetest victory imaginable. And Karen? She never called the cops on a lemonade stand again. 2.